Hey, how's it going, everyone? This is Mike. Welcome back to my channel, and this is the last part 5 of my list of top 100 favorite films. And there are a few new additions on the list, this part of the list that weren't here the last time I did this. So let's get started. Thanks to everybody who stayed with me through all of this. I appreciate all the comments, all the views, and new subscribers, and it's just been a really nice experience. And thanks for watching all of my friends as well. So it's a lot of fun doing this. Okay, number 20, I have The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, 1948, directed by John Huston, starring Humphrey Bogart, John Huston's father, Walter Huston, and Tim Holt. Three men stuck in Mexico, three Americans, who are down on their luck and trying to find a way to make a buck. And the two younger guys, Bogart and Holt, meet up with an older guy who is a former prospector. He knows where to look for gold, right? Walter Huston. So he convinces these guys to pool whatever resources they have and go up into the mountains in Mexico and look for gold. And they find it. But the old guy warns the other two that something happens to people when they start finding gold. They just sort of get this gold fever and they start to change and they become very paranoid about other people trying to get their stuff. And that's exactly what happens with these three people, and to no one more than it does to the Bogart character. I can't remember any of the names of the characters in the film. So, but Bogart gives one of his best performances. It's an adventure story as much as it is a psychological character study of all three of these men, especially the Bogart character. It's a fantastic movie, and I like it more every time I see it. Next up is a film that's fairly new, about a year old, a couple of years. This is A Ghost Story, starring Casey Affleck and Rooney Mara. And yeah, there's a ghost, and you might think this is supposed to be kind of funny or a horror film, but it's neither. It's about a young man and a young woman living together in this very normal-looking ranch house somewhere in the United States. And it's never clear whether or not they're married. Doesn't seem to matter. But they have a decent relationship. And at the beginning of the film, they're disagreeing on whether or not they're going to stay in this house or move on. And the guy wants to stay. He feels very connected to the house for some reason. And the girl wants to move on. The guy is a musician. And so early in the film, the guy is killed in a car accident right in front of the house, and we see the young woman in the hospital looking at her husband, boyfriend, lying under a sheet on a gurney and saying goodbye to him, and then she leaves the room. The camera is fixed. It's not moving. It's just watching the action, and then all of a sudden there's no one in the room but the guy's body, and after a minute or two he suddenly sits up with the sheet over him and gets up and walks out of the hospital. No one sees him, and he walks back to the house. And of course, somehow there are holes in the sheet where his eyes can see what's going on. And it's the strangest movie you will ever see, because it's all about love and loss and time and eternity. And it doesn't necessarily have a linear plot line. It's just kind of a meditation on all of those things. And it's very quiet. It's very sad, but it's just fascinating, and I thought it was one of the most interesting movies I'd ever seen. So anyway, very good movie, and it is supposedly Casey Affleck underneath this sheet during the entire film, even though you can't see him. Okay. Next up is another Bogart classic. This is In a Lonely Place from 1950. Yeah, 1950 or 51. 1950, directed by Nicholas Ray. Bogart and Gloria Graham star. And both of them give great performances. It's a film noir. Bogart plays a writer in Hollywood who is very cynical, very angry, down on his luck, not doing very well. And he is trying to get his life together and not being very successful. And he, through circumstances that happen early in the film, he is suspected of killing a young woman who actually he met in a bar, and he invited her over to his house, not for anything sexual, but because she was reading a novel that he was going to adapt and make into a screenplay, and he hadn't read it yet. He was too lazy to read it. So when he found out that this young woman knew the story, he asked her to come over and tell him the story. Well, that's all there was to it. And anyway, she was found dead the next day, and he was the last person supposedly who saw her. Well, another woman who he didn't know, who lives in his apartment complex, played by Gloria Graham, is a witness to the fact that he wasn't there. I mean, he actually put her in a cab and she went home. Anyway, so she saves the guy from being accused of the murder, but she finds out, as they start to have an affair together, she finds out that this guy has a very quick temper, and she begins to wonder if maybe he would be capable of actually killing somebody on impulse. And so once again, it's a great performance by Bogart, many layers to his character, and he and Gloria Graham do beautifully together. It's a shame they didn't make more films together. So, okay, In a Lonely Place. Next up is one of my favorite horror films, The Haunting, from 1963, directed by Robert Wise, starring Julie Harris, Claire Bloom, Richard Johnson, and Russ Tamblyn, based on a terrific novel by Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House. It's in black and white. It's one of the films that doesn't really show you any ghosts. It doesn't show you any supernatural happenings. Everything is suggested by camera angles and sounds and the reactions of the people who are seeing and hearing things. And it is truly one of the most frightening films that you will ever see. And I need to upgrade this. I still have the snapper case. I understand there's a better version that's come out, and this is one that I will definitely replace eventually. So, The Haunting. Next up is another horror film that I love so much, from 1944. This is The Uninvited, starring Ray Milland, Ruth Hussey, and a beautiful young actress named Gail Russell. And also Donald Crisp is in it, Alan Napier. It's sort of partly a comedy at the beginning. It has some funny moments in it, very light moments, about a brother and a sister in England, and they are best friends as well as being brother and sister. And they are out taking a long walk one day in the country in Devonshire, and they come across this beautiful house on a cliff, and they find out that it's available for sale, and they just sort of on impulse, they decide, we want to buy this house. We have a real feeling about this house. And they find out there's a lot more going on in the place than they had expected. The film doesn't introduce Gail Russell, but it was the first really good part that she had. She had done a few films before, but just a beautiful young actress who ended up being a very tragic person, unfortunately. One thing about this film that is so memorable is the score, and the theme music was eventually made into a standard called Stella by Starlight, and it reflects a scene in the film where Ray Milland, who is a composer, is composing a sonata, and he's calling it To Stella by Starlight. Stella is the name of the character played by Gail Russell, and it's just very haunting and beautiful. And okay, I'm babbling, sorry. Next up is my favorite John Cassavetes film, Opening Night, from 1978 or 1977, one of the two. Gena Rowlands takes center stage in this one. John Cassavetes is in it, also Ben Gazzara, Joan Blondell is in it. It's all about a woman named Myrtle Gordon, who is a Broadway actress, who is having a midlife crisis. She's dealing with getting older. She's not doing well. And she happens to be in a play which is about a woman who's getting older and is not doing well. And she is just absolutely freaking out. This is one of the best things that Gena Rowlands ever did. She is very physical in this film, and she's falling all over the place, and very emotional, very beautiful and unusual story. So, okay, next up is the classic Frankenstein, 1931, Boris Karloff, directed by James Whale. Of all the Universal horror films, and I love them all for different reasons, but this is probably the most serious and accomplished work, I feel, and the way that James Whale photographed it and constructed it has so much sympathy for the monster, even though he's frightening to look at. And it's almost like a German expressionistic film. It's beautifully shot. Karloff is just incredible. and it's worth watching again and again. I was lucky enough to see this on the big screen, and it just opened up for me in a way that I had never seen it before. And it's a great, great film. Next up is Rebel Without a Cause. James Dean, Natalie Wood, and Sal Mineo. Corey Allen as Buzz. This is from 1955. This is the film that was released right after James Dean had died at the age of 24. So it was a very emotional experience for the young people of the time. And I love this movie so much, and I've seen it so many times, and it gets to me every single time that I see it. I can't help it. Just the music, everything about it. Performances are great. James Dean was so emotional and matched perfectly by young Natalie Wood and teenage Sal Mineo, who became a big star after this film. This was James Dean's penultimate film. He had one more to go that would be released, Giant. I think this is the best thing he ever did. Rebel Without a Cause. Okay. Next up is one of my favorite film noirs. This is Detour, 1945, directed by Edgar G. Ulmer, starring Tom Neal and Ann Savage in a very basic kind of a crime drama, psychological drama, film noir, a plot about a young man who is just trying to hitchhike from New York to California to be with his girlfriend, and he happens to get picked up by a man who unfortunately happens to have a heart condition, and he dies on the way. And this guy who's hitchhiking is so afraid that the police are going to accuse him of killing this guy that he actually drags his body off into the desert and takes over the man's identity. And unfortunately, he makes another mistake. After that particular detour, he makes another mistake by picking up a hitchhiker, played by Ann Savage, not knowing that she had been riding with the guy who actually was the owner of the car. So she knows that this guy did something to the first guy. Anyway, it's kind of a convoluted plot the way I'm making it sound, but great performances by both of these actors. Ann Savage was terrific in this film, and it's a very low budget, low case film that didn't get a lot of attention when it came out, but it became a bona fide classic later on, and it's a true cult movie. Next up is my favorite science fiction film of all time, Forbidden Planet, 1956. Leslie Nielsen, before he became a legendary comedian. We have Anne Francis, Walter Pidgeon. It's sort of a science fiction version of the story of The Tempest by William Shakespeare, and I just love it. I know a lot of people think that it's dated and all that sort of thing, but not for me. It's still my #1 science fiction movie. Robbie the Robot, everything about it, the sets, the sounds, the electronic music, and all that stuff. I love it. Next up, one of my favorite horror films, The Pit and the Pendulum, 1961, directed by Roger Corman, the second Roger Corman adaptation of an Edgar Allan Poe novel. The first was The House of Usher. This one I think is the best of the series, although it's kind of hard to pick. They're all terrific, but this is so wonderful. Vincent Price, John Carr, and Barbara Steele, also Luana Anders and Anthony Carbone. It's nothing supernatural really happens in this movie. It's just all gothic atmosphere, haunted castle, or you think it's haunted. Barbara Steele actually has a small part in this film. She got the part in this film because Roger Corman had seen Black Sunday, which had been released and had been purchased by American International Studios, and he liked her so much he wanted her for the part in this film. And so she I think it's impossible to take your eyes off of her even when she's in a scene with Vincent Price. She is the only one who can probably steal a scene from Vincent Price, and they are really good together. Great movie. Next up is another classic film noir, also very much a Hollywood story. This is Sunset Boulevard, 1950, directed by Billy Wilder, starring William Holden and Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson playing Norma Desmond, a silent film actress who is she's been out of the public eye for so long that she's a recluse. She's a little bit crazy, getting crazier by the minute, and she wants to make a comeback. She's written this long, confused screenplay of the story of Salome, and she wants William Holden, who is a sort of a hack writer. He's trying to be a writer, a screenwriter, to move into her house. They meet by accident, and help her finish the story, and he becomes her paid companion, gets very involved. He's not very happy with himself, but it's interesting that Gloria Swanson was a famous silent film actress who did make the transition to sound films very well, but after a few years her career started to decline, and she stopped making films in 1935, I believe it was. She made another film in 1941, which didn't go over terribly well. And thereafter, she was a businesswoman. She was working on Broadway quite frequently, so she was anything but a crazy recluse. But people identify Gloria Swanson so much with Norma Desmond just because of the similarities of the fact that they were both silent film stars. But it's a fascinating film. Next up is one of my favorite, my absolute favorite Woody Allen film, Hannah and Her Sisters, from 1987, I believe, or 86. Michael Caine, Mia Farrow, Woody Allen is also in it, Barbara Hershey, Diane Weist, Carrie Fisher, all about these three sisters living in New York City. One of them is an actress. Now, the mother of these three sisters is played by Maureen O'Sullivan, who, of course, in real life was the mother of Mia Farrow. And it's a fascinating film showcasing all these different personalities, their love lives, how they get along with each other. And Woody Allen's part in it is this very paranoid guy. What's the word? Hypochondriac. He's worried that he has a brain tumor, and he finds out that he doesn't have a brain tumor. And instead of making him happy, it throws him into this existential, disastrous situation where what is the meaning of life? Where is God? Is there a God? And at the end of the movie, I don't want to give too much away, but at the end of the movie, it is the most life-affirming feeling that you will ever have. Somehow, all the comedy and the black comedy and the hypochondria, it all turns around and it becomes a beautiful and positive message at the end of the film. And I just love it. Next up is a beautiful movie from Terrence Malick, Days of Heaven. I just absolutely adore this movie. 1978, Richard Gere, Brooke Adams, Sam Shepard, and a young actress named Linda Manns, who never really had much of a career, but she serves as not only a character in the film, but also as the narrator. And she has a very unique sort of a Brooklyn accent that fits beautifully with the dialogue. It's beautiful to look at. It's as much a visual feast as it is a story. In fact, the way it looks is probably more important than the story. Yeah, it just blew me away when I first saw it, and I never get tired of watching it. Next up is a classic horror film, but also it's very much a Hollywood story. This is Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, Victor Buono. Okay, so Davis and Crawford were contemporaries back in the 1930s and 1940s. They never worked together, only for a very short time were they at the same studio, so they weren't necessarily rivals, only for a very brief time in their later late 1940s. But supposedly they just despised each other, and nobody knows if it's really true or not. But they somehow they ended up in this movie together, directed by Robert Aldrich, and they worked so well together. It's just it's a shame they weren't the best of friends. They could have made a series of films, but it's all about two sisters who, back in the early days, in the 1930s, they were both actresses, and something happened where one of the sisters, played by Joan Crawford, was injured, and she's spending the rest of her life in a wheelchair, being taken care of by her crazy sister, Jane, who is a former she's a former vaudeville child actress named Baby Jane Hudson, and she still dresses up like Baby Jane Hudson. So it's just a great, great film with great performances, not just by Bette Davis. She's wonderful in the film. She got an Academy Award nomination, but Joan Crawford is equally good in this film, and yeah, it's just a classic. Okay, next up, Seconds, directed by John Frankenheimer in 1966, starring Rock Hudson. It's all about a man who gets a second chance at youth and having a completely new life. John Randolph, a character actor, plays a man named Arthur Hamilton, who is unhappy with his very successful business life. He has a marriage to a lovely lady that he's just gotten bored with, and he finds out that there is a mysterious organization simply known as the Company, which for an ungodly amount of money will arrange to give that person an entirely new identity by plastic surgery, new identity cards and papers, and staging a death of your real identity, even furnishing a body, right? So that you can go off and be something else. So John Randolph goes under extensive surgery and wakes up as young, handsome Rock Hudson. Well, it doesn't go terribly well for this new guy, Rock Hudson. Tony Wilson is the name they give him. He finds that he cannot forget what he once was. It's a great film. Like my good friend James Higgins always says, it's like an extended episode of the old Twilight Zone, where you think that you're going to get something really wonderful by getting everything you've ever dreamed of, and then it turns into a nightmare, literally a nightmare. Great movie. Next up is a classic Bette Davis film from 1950, All About Eve, directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz. The best picture of that year, all about an aging actress, Margot Channing, who is in love with a man who is 8 years younger than she is, Gary Merrill, and she doesn't trust the relationship. She's afraid she's going to lose him, so she's ready to be jealous of anybody that comes along and always questioning him. And she gets approached by a young woman named Eve Harrington, played by Ann Baxter, who is supposed to be a really dedicated fan of Margot, but she really has an agenda, and Margot doesn't realize it until it's almost too late. Thelma Ritter is in this, Celeste Holm, Hugh Marlowe, also a very young Marilyn Monroe in one of her first showcase roles in her career, and it's just a fantastic movie. All right. Next up is my favorite Hitchcock film. This is Vertigo, James Stewart and Kim Novak, and it's beautiful to look at. I promise you get the Blu-ray, although the DVD is terrific. It's a story that takes you in one direction, and then in the middle of the movie it takes you somewhere you were not expecting. It becomes something completely different. A lot of people complain about Kim Novak in this film, and they don't think she's a good actress. I totally disagree. I think she's perfect for this role. She's perfect in the way she looks and the way she reacts to James Stewart's character, who becomes a man who is very obsessed with making her into something else. It's a beautiful story. Was not successful when it first came out, and but it's become a classic now, and I love it. Okay, next up, my number one horror film of all time. I've talked about this incessantly. I won't go on and on about it. Black Sunday, directed by Mario Bava, 1960, released in America in 1961 in a slightly altered version, starring the marvelous Barbara Steele, which was not her first film, but it was the first film that she had a starring role in, and it was tailor-made for her. Black and white photography by Bava himself, and he showcased her unusual features and her intensity. I don't even think she was aware of what she was bringing to the screen. She says that she never saw the film or any part of it until the mid-1970s, and she had no idea, she had no sense of sort of being self-conscious about what she was doing. She just, the intensity just came through somehow. She was only 21 years old. A vampire fantasy. She plays a witch who is executed. She also happens to be a vampire. It's kind of a convoluted story based on a novel by Nikolai Gogol called The V. Well, a short story actually, which I've read, and it's very different than the story. But the only element they keep out of it was the fact that there's a witch that comes back to life. But anyway, it's beautiful to look at, and very, very much worth seeing. Okay, finally, my number one film, and it has been for a long time, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. The Night of the Hunter, from 1955, directed by Charles Laughton, the only film he directed. And this was not a hit when it came out. It disappeared very quickly, had mixed reactions from the public, mixed reactions from critics, but it's now considered to be one of the best films ever made. Robert Mitchum, Shelley Winters, and Lillian Gish. And Robert Mitchum plays preacher Harry Powell, a guy who's supposed to be a minister of the gospel, but he also has some very sick ideas about women, and he likes to seduce women and take their money and kill them. So he finds out that Peter Graves, who is the husband of Shelley Winters, he happens to be in jail with this guy at the same time, finds out that Peter Graves stole $10,000 and is hiding it somewhere. So after Peter Graves is executed for murder, he goes after Peter Graves' widow, Shelley Winters, and their 2 children, played by a terrific child actor named Billy Chapin, and another young actress named, oh, what was her name? I just now forgot. The little girl who played Pearl. I'm sorry, I completely forgot. But Billy Chapin is actually at the center of the film, really, and he is almost the central character, the most important character in the movie. But it's a beautiful movie that cannot be classified. It's part fairy tale, part film noir, very melodramatic, even moments of black comedy, and it's beautiful to look at, photographed by Stanley Cortez. And it's a shame that Charles Laughton never made another film. It's the best thing that Robert Mitchum ever did, and I think he also felt that it was the best thing they ever did. So, all right, so that's my list of films, and I've taken 26 more minutes of your life. Thanks for watching, and I'll do this again next year if I'm still around. Let's see.